She walked into that classroom thinking respect came with the title, but these students had other plans. They saw a small, quiet woman and decided she was easy prey. What they didn't know was that their new English teacher had spent 15 years perfecting the art of breaking bones, and when they shattered her phone in front of the entire class, they were about to discover that some lessons can't be taught from a textbook. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in room 204 at Riverside High School, casting their sterile glow across rows of scratched desks and faded motivational posters. Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of her classroom, smoothing down her navy blazer, as she watched students filter in for third-period English literature. At 28, she looked younger than her years, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she was supposed to be: a fresh-faced teacher, ready to inspire young minds with Shakespeare and Steinbeck. The reality was far more complicated. Sarah had left her position at a prestigious private school in Philadelphia not for adventure or a fresh start, but because she needed to disappear from a world that had consumed her for over a decade. Millbrook, Pennsylvania represented everything Philadelphia wasn't: quiet, predictable, safe. The kind of place where the biggest drama was usually who made varsity and who didn't, where teachers could focus on teaching instead of wondering if they'd make it through another day. Sarah had grown up in North Philadelphia, where survival often depended on how quickly you could assess a threat and respond accordingly. Her father, Marcus Rivera, had owned a small boxing gym tucked between a corner store and a laundromat, the kind of place where neighborhood kids learned discipline alongside proper footwork. Marcus had been a middleweight contender in his youth, never quite making it to the big time, but earning enough respect to keep his gym doors open and his daughter fed. When Sarah turned 12 and started walking home alone through increasingly dangerous streets, Marcus made a decision that would shape her entire life. Instead of keeping her sheltered, he brought her into the gym after school, teaching her not boxing but something he believed was more practical for a young woman: Muay Thai. The art of 8 limbs, he called it, using fists, elbows, knees, and shins as weapons. More importantly, he taught her that real strength came from knowing when not to use those weapons. For 15 years, Sarah had trained under her father's watchful eye, competing in amateur tournaments, earning her instructor certification, learning to read opponents like she would later learn to read literature. She could break boards with her elbows, shatter concrete blocks with her shins, and deliver kicks that could drop men twice her size. But Marcus had drilled one lesson deeper than all the others. A warrior's greatest victory was the fight that never happened. Teaching had always been Sarah's plan, even as she dominated in the ring. She'd earned her master's in English literature while maintaining her training schedule, believing she could inspire students the way Marcus had inspired her. At her previous school, St. Catherine's Preparatory Academy, she'd been beloved by students and respected by colleagues. Her classroom had been a sanctuary where even the most reluctant readers discovered the power of words. But private school students came with private school problems, and when the son of a major donor had tried to leverage his family's influence in ways that made Sarah's skin crawl, she'd made it clear that certain behaviors wouldn't be tolerated in her classroom or anywhere else. The aftermath had been swift and brutal. Donors pulled funding, administrators questioned her judgment, and colleagues who had once sought her advice suddenly found reasons to avoid her in the hallways. Rather than fight a battle she couldn't win, Sarah had quietly submitted her resignation and applied for positions in small towns where her reputation couldn't follow her. Riverside High School had been desperate enough for qualified English teachers that they'd hired her within a week of her application, and Sarah had convinced herself that a fresh start was exactly what she needed. What she hadn't anticipated was how different public school dynamics could be from the structured environment she'd known. At St. Catherine's, respect for authority was assumed, discipline was rarely an issue, and students understood that their education was a privilege. Riverside High operated under entirely different rules, where respect had to be earned, authority was constantly tested, and some students viewed education as a sentence to be endured rather than an opportunity to be embraced. Sarah's first week had been a gentle introduction to these realities. Students tested boundaries in small ways, talking during instruction, forgetting homework, arriving late with elaborate excuses. She'd handled these challenges with patience and consistency, believing that time and mutual respect would solve most problems. Her colleagues had warned her about certain students, mentioning names with knowing looks and sympathetic headshakes, but Sarah had dismissed their concerns as the inevitable grumbling of teachers who'd forgotten why they'd entered the profession. Brandon Walsh's name had come up more than once in these conversations. A senior with the build of someone who'd been lifting weights since middle school, Brandon carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His father owned 3 car dealerships in the county, and his mother sat on the school board, facts that seemed to follow Brandon like shadows wherever he went. Teachers spoke of him in the careful tones reserved for students who existed in that dangerous gray area between challenging and untouchable. Connor Hayes and Dylan Pierce orbited Brandon like satellites, neither possessing his natural charisma or family connections but both content to bask in his reflected status. Connor was tall and lanky, all elbows and nervous energy, quick with a cruel joke when he sensed weakness. Dylan was quieter, more calculating, the type who watched and waited for opportunities to prove his loyalty to Brandon through small acts of cruelty. The 3 of them had enrolled in Sarah's 3rd period advanced literature class, not out of any love for reading, but because it was widely considered an easy credit. The previous teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had been months away from retirement when she'd suffered a mild heart attack at the end of the previous school year. By all accounts, she'd been a lovely woman who'd simply run out of energy for classroom management, allowing students like Brandon and his crew to coast through with minimal effort as long as they didn't cause major disruptions. Sarah represented change, and change was something Brandon Walsh didn't handle well. From her first day, she'd made it clear that her classroom would operate differently. Phones went in a basket at the beginning of class. Students were expected to participate in discussions. Assignments had actual deadlines with actual consequences. Most students adapted quickly, even appreciating the structure, but Brandon's group viewed these expectations as personal attacks on their established order. The testing began subtly. Brandon would arrive exactly 60 seconds late, just enough to disrupt the flow of class without earning a formal tardy. Connor would sigh dramatically whenever Sarah called on him, making it clear that her questions were beneath his intelligence. Dylan would stare out the window during instruction, then claim confusion when asked to contribute to discussions he'd obviously ignored. Sarah recognized these tactics for what they were: boundary testing designed to establish whether she was someone who could be pushed around or someone who would push back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. St. Catherine's, she'd dealt with entitled students before, but those conflicts had been about academic standards rather than basic respect. Here, she was fighting for something more fundamental: the right to teach without interference. Her father's voice echoed in her memory during these moments, reminding her that every opponent telegraphed their intentions if you knew how to read the signs. Brandon's body language screamed aggression barely held in check, from the way he sprawled in his desk to claim maximum space to the manner in which he made eye contact just long enough to be disrespectful without being overtly threatening. Connor's nervous energy manifested in constant motion, tapping pens, shuffling papers, drumming fingers, all designed to create a low-level distraction that made concentration difficult. Dylan's stillness was perhaps the most unnerving, a predatory patience that suggested he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Marcus had taught Sarah to recognize these patterns not just in the ring but in life, explaining that bullies followed predictable scripts regardless of the arena in which they operated. They would escalate gradually, testing limits until they found someone who wouldn't push back, then exploit that weakness mercilessly. The key was to establish boundaries early and maintain them consistently. But Sarah also knew that in a school environment, her options for response were severely limited. She couldn't simply walk away from these students the way she might avoid a problematic situation outside of school. She couldn't respond with the kind of direct confrontation that might work in other contexts. Instead, she had to navigate the complex web of school policies, parental influence, and administrative politics while somehow maintaining order in her classroom and respect for her position. By the end of her second week at Riverside High, Sarah understood that her situation was becoming untenable. Brandon's group had established a pattern of low-level disruption that made teaching increasingly difficult, while staying just below the threshold that would trigger administrative intervention. They'd figured out exactly how much they could get away with, and they were systematically dismantling her authority one small transgression at a time. The moment Sarah had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. She'd arrived early to prepare for the day, reviewing her lesson plans and organizing materials for a discussion about character motivation in Macbeth. The irony of teaching about unchecked ambition and its consequences while dealing with Brandon's behavior wasn't lost on her. But she pushed those thoughts aside as students began filing into room 204. Brandon entered with his usual swagger, Connor and Dylan flanking him like bodyguards. The rest of the class followed, a mix of genuinely interested students and others who simply wanted to earn their credits without drama. Sarah had learned to appreciate the students who actually wanted to learn, finding in their engagement a reminder of why she'd become a teacher in the first place. As had become routine, Sarah asked students to place their phones in the basket at the front of the room. Most complied without complaint, understanding that this policy applied to everyone equally. Brandon, however, had been testing this boundary for days, arguing that he needed his phone for emergencies or claiming that his parents required him to be reachable at all times. Today, Sarah decided the testing would end. Brandon made no move toward the phone basket as other students settled into their seats. Instead, he pulled out his device deliberately, placing it on his desk like a declaration of independence. The screen lit up with notifications, and he made a show of checking each one while Sarah began her opening remarks about the day's lesson. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, "your phone needs to go in the basket with everyone else's." Brandon looked up with exaggerated surprise, as if he'd forgotten she existed. "Oh, sorry, Miss Mitchell. My mom's texting me about a doctor's appointment. Family emergency stuff, you know?" It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah could see the Instagram notifications flashing on his screen, could hear the soft ping of incoming messages that had nothing to do with medical appointments. But Brandon delivered the excuse with practiced sincerity, the kind of smooth deception that came from years of talking his way out of consequences. Sarah had encountered this exact scenario dozens of times in her teaching career. The student who believed that a creative excuse trumped classroom rules, who thought that authority was negotiable if you just found the right angle. At St. Catherine's, she'd learned to navigate these moments with a combination of firmness and flexibility, understanding that sometimes the battle over a phone wasn't worth the war over classroom respect. But this wasn't St. Catherine's, and Brandon Walsh wasn't a privileged prep school student testing boundaries within an established framework of mutual respect. This was something different, something that reminded Sarah of the territorial challenges she'd witnessed in her father's gym, where newcomers had to prove they belonged before they could earn the right to train alongside established fighters. "I understand family matters are important," Sarah replied, walking slowly toward Brandon's desk. "However, the phone policy applies to everyone, regardless of circumstances. If there's a genuine emergency, the office can reach you through official channels." Connor snickered from his seat 2 rows back, a sound just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Dylan remained motionless, but Sarah caught the slight upturn of his lips, the barely concealed satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold. Brandon's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the mask of polite confusion giving way to something harder. "Look, I get that you're new here and trying to prove something, but my family situation is kind of personal. I'm not comfortable putting my phone somewhere I can't reach it." The challenge was unmistakable now, delivered with just enough respect to avoid outright insubordination while making it clear that he had no intention of complying. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her shoulders that always preceded conflict, the subtle shift in her breathing that her father had taught her to recognize as her body preparing for confrontation. Marcus Rivera had never been a big man, standing barely 5'8" in his prime, but he'd possessed a presence that filled whatever space he occupied. Sarah had inherited his compact build, along with his ability to project calm authority even in chaotic situations. In the gym, she'd watched him diffuse tensions between hot-headed fighters with nothing more than a steady voice and unwavering eye contact. "Respect isn't demanded, Misha," he'd told her during one of their evening training sessions, his hands wrapping protective tape around her wrists with practiced efficiency. "It's earned through consistency. Every interaction is a test of who you really are when pressure builds." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she stood beside Brandon's desk, acutely aware that every student in the room was watching this exchange with the kind of focused attention they rarely showed during actual lessons. This moment would define not just her relationship with Brandon, but her credibility with every student who witnessed it. "Mr. Walsh," she said, extending her hand palm up, "your phone, please." For several seconds, the classroom existed in perfect silence. Brandon stared at Sarah's outstretched hand, as if it represented something personally offensive, while she maintained her position with the kind of patient stillness that came from years of meditation and disciplined training. Her father had taught her that true strength revealed itself not in explosive action but in moments like this, where will met will and only one person could prevail. Brandon's phone buzzed again, the notifications sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Without breaking eye contact with Sarah, he reached for the device, and for a moment she thought he might actually comply. Instead, he picked it up and began typing a response to whatever message had just arrived. "Can't leave my mom hanging," he said with a shrug that was designed to appear casual but carried undertones of deliberate disrespect. "She's worried about my anxiety levels. Doctor says stress isn't good for my condition." It was masterfully done, Sarah had to admit. Brandon had managed to invoke both parental authority and medical necessity while simultaneously continuing the exact behavior she'd asked him to stop. The excuse was ridiculous, but it was also carefully constructed to make any further challenge seem unreasonable or even cruel. Connor's snicker became an outright laugh, quickly stifled but loud enough to encourage other students to join in. Sarah could feel the moment slipping away from her, could sense the delicate balance of classroom authority tilting in Brandon's favor. Every teacher faced moments like this, crossroads where backing down meant losing credibility while pressing forward risk escalation that could spiral beyond control. In her father's gym, Sarah had learned to read opponents through subtle physical cues that revealed their intentions before they fully committed to action. Brandon's posture told her everything she needed to know about his mindset. He was testing not just her resolve but her competence, probing for weaknesses that he could exploit in future encounters. This wasn't about his phone or his mother or any medical condition. This was about establishing dominance in what he clearly viewed as his territory. Sarah had faced similar challenges in the ring, opponents who tried to intimidate her through psychological warfare before the actual fighting began. She'd learned that responding to these tactics required a combination of mental toughness and strategic thinking. You couldn't allow yourself to be drawn into emotional reactions, but you also couldn't appear weak or uncertain. "I'm going to count to 3, Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that her father had used when young fighters pushed boundaries in his gym. "If your phone isn't in the basket by the time I reach 3, you'll be visiting Principal Carter to explain why you can't follow basic classroom expectations." Brandon's eyes flashed with surprise. Clearly, he hadn't expected this level of direct confrontation from someone he'd sized up as easily manipulated. For the first time since the exchange began, he seemed uncertain about his next move. "Seriously?" he said, attempting to salvage his position through incredulous laughter. "You're gonna send me to the office because I'm texting my mom about a medical appointment?" "1," Sarah said. The word hung in the air, like a challenge issued in an empty boxing ring. Brandon's fingers stopped moving across his phone screen, though he continued holding the device as if it were a lifeline to his dignity. "This is actually insane," Connor muttered from his seat, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he seemed to recognize that the dynamics in the room had shifted in ways that none of them had anticipated. 2, Sarah continued, her tone unchanged. Brandon's jaw tightened visibly. Sarah could see him calculating odds, weighing the social cost of backing down against the potential consequences of forcing her to follow through on her ultimatum. She'd placed him in an impossible position: comply and lose face in front of his friends, or refuse and risk administrative intervention that could have real repercussions. In that moment, Brandon made a choice that revealed more about his character than hours of observation could have provided. Instead of placing his phone in the basket or even continuing to text, he stood up abruptly, the sudden motion sending his desk chair rolling backward into the wall with a sharp crash. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising above the conversational level they'd maintained throughout their standoff. "I don't have to deal with this power trip garbage." And then, with deliberate precision, He raised his phone above his head and brought it down hard against the corner of his desk. The sound of expensive technology meeting solid wood echoed through room 204 like a gunshot. Fragments of screen glass scattered across the floor, and the device's casing split along multiple stress lines. Brandon held up the destroyed phone for everyone to see, its shattered display reflecting the fluorescent lights in 1,000 fractured pieces. "There," he announced with theatrical satisfaction. "Problem solved. No phone, no violation of your precious policy." The destruction had been calculated and deliberate, designed to shock Sarah into backing down, while simultaneously demonstrating that he would rather destroy his own property than submit to her authority. It was the kind of dramatic gesture that teenagers often believed would resolve conflicts in their favor, a nuclear option that seemed powerful in the moment, but revealed profound miscalculations about consequences and adult responses. What Brandon hadn't anticipated was Sarah's reaction, or rather, her lack of one. Instead of anger or surprise or even concern about the destroyed property, she simply nodded once and walked back to her desk with the same measured pace she'd used to approach his. "Thank you for resolving the phone issue, Mr. Walsh," she said, her voice carrying no trace of sarcasm despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Please take your seat so we can begin today's lesson." Brandon remained standing, clearly expecting a different response to his dramatic gesture. The silence in the room had become oppressive, filled with the kind of tension that preceded either explosive confrontation or complete capitulation. Sarah had witnessed similar moments in her father's gym, when cocky newcomers tried to intimidate established fighters through displays of aggression that revealed more about their insecurity than their strength. Marcus had taught her to recognize these behaviors as symptoms of deeper problems, manifestations of people who'd learned to mistake destruction for power. Violence against objects, he'd explained during one of their training sessions, usually means someone doesn't know how to channel their energy constructively. They're dangerous not because they're strong, but because they're unpredictable. Sarah understood now that Brandon's phone destruction fell into this category. It wasn't an act of strength or defiance, but rather a public admission that he couldn't handle conflict without resorting to destructive behavior. The broken device on his desk represented his inability to navigate a simple disagreement like a mature adult. "I said sit down, Mr. Walsh," Sarah repeated, this time with enough edge in her voice to cut through Brandon's confusion about why his grand gesture hadn't produced the desired effect. For several more seconds, Brandon remained standing, trapped between his need to appear in control and his growing realization that he'd misjudged both the situation and his opponent. Finally, he dropped back into his chair with enough force to make the plastic creak ominously. Sarah opened her lesson plan and began discussing Macbeth's character development as if nothing unusual had happened. She'd learned this technique from her father, who'd taught her that the best way to handle attention-seeking behavior was to deny it the audience it required to be effective. But even as she guided students through analysis of Shakespeare's ambitious protagonist, Sarah remained hyper-aware of the broken phone pieces scattered across the floor near Brandon's desk. Each fragment caught the light differently, creating a small constellation of destruction that seemed to pulse with unresolved tension. Brandon sat in sullen silence for the remainder of class, occasionally shooting glares in Sarah's direction, but no longer attempting to disrupt the lesson. Connor and Dylan had also gone quiet, apparently sensing that their leader's dramatic gesture had somehow backfired in ways they didn't fully understand. When the bell rang, students filed out with unusual speed, most of them careful to avoid stepping on phone fragments as they made their way to the door. Brandon lingered at his desk until the room was nearly empty, then stood and walked toward Sarah with deliberate slowness. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice low enough that no remaining students could hear clearly. Sarah looked up from her desk, where she'd been organizing materials for her next class. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to really study Brandon's face, noting the barely controlled anger that tightened his features and the way his hands had curled into loose fists at his sides. Her father had taught her to recognize these physical signs as preludes to escalation, warning signals that rational conversation was becoming impossible. In the gym, he would have separated sparring partners who displayed this level of agitation, understanding that emotions could override training and lead to someone getting hurt. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said quietly, "I suggest you clean up the glass from your phone before someone gets injured. And next time you have a family emergency, I recommend using the office phone like every other student in this school." Brandon's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Connor appeared in the doorway with obvious impatience. "Dude, we're gonna be late for fourth period," he called out, clearly wanting to extract his friend from a conversation that had already gone badly wrong. Brandon glanced between Sarah and Connor, apparently weighing his options. Finally, he turned and walked toward the door without another word, leaving the broken phone pieces scattered across the floor like evidence of a crime scene. After the room emptied completely, Sarah sat alone among the debris of Brandon's tantrum, understanding that she'd just witnessed something significant. The destruction of his phone hadn't been about defying her authority or proving his independence. It had been about demonstrating that he was willing to destroy anything, including his own possessions, rather than accept that someone else might have legitimate power over his actions. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her of lessons learned in spaces where respect was earned through consistent demonstration of character rather than inherited through family connections or social position. Real fighters, Marcus had told her, understand that every battle is really about something bigger than the immediate conflict. The person who loses control first usually loses everything else too. Sarah began picking up the larger pieces of Brandon's broken phone, careful not to cut herself on the sharp edges. As she worked, she reflected on how perfectly this moment encapsulated the challenges she'd hoped to leave behind in Philadelphia. Different setting, different players, but the same fundamental dynamics of power, respect, and the lengths people would go to avoid acknowledging their own limitations. The broken phone represented more than teenage defiance or classroom disruption. It was a declaration of war disguised as a temper tantrum, and Sarah understood that Brandon Walsh had just guaranteed that their conflict would escalate far beyond anything either of them had originally intended. The custodian found Sarah still kneeling beside Brandon's desk 20 minutes after the final bell, methodically collecting phone fragments with the kind of focused precision that suggested this was more than simple cleanup. She'd wrapped the larger pieces in tissues and deposited them in a small cardboard box, treating the debris with the care one might show evidence at a crime scene. "Rough day?" asked Jerry Martinez, the evening custodian who'd been working at Riverside High for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen plenty of classroom incidents over the years, but something about this particular scene struck him as different. Sarah looked up from her careful collection work, managing a tired smile. "Student accidentally broke his phone during class. Just making sure nobody steps on anything sharp tomorrow morning." Jerry nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. In his experience, phones didn't typically shatter into quite so many pieces through accidents, and teachers didn't usually spend their free time protecting students from the consequences of their own carelessness. "Want me to get a vacuum for the smaller bits?" he offered, setting down his cart of cleaning supplies. "That would be helpful, thank you." As Jerry retrieved a small handheld vacuum from his equipment, Sarah continued her methodical collection process. Each fragment she gathered represented not just broken technology, but shattered expectations about how her new position would unfold. She'd come to Millbrook hoping for simplicity, for the kind of straightforward teaching environment where her biggest challenges would involve reluctant readers rather than aggressive power struggles. The vacuum's whirring filled the quiet classroom as Jerry efficiently removed the remaining glass particles from the floor around Brandon's desk. Sarah watched him work, noting the easy competence that came from years of cleaning up after other people's messes. There was something comforting about his matter-of-fact approach to the destruction, as if broken phones in classrooms were just another occupational hazard to be managed and moved past. "Kids these days," Jerry muttered as he finished the cleanup, though his tone carried more resignation than judgment. "Got more technology than they know what to do with, but somehow less common sense than we had growing up." Sarah thanked him for his help and gathered her materials for the day, but instead of heading directly to her car, she found herself walking toward the gymnasium. Riverside High's athletic facilities were modest compared to what she'd known in Philadelphia, but the familiar smell of floor wax and old wrestling mats triggered memories that transported her back 15 years to her father's gym. Rivera's Boxing had occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building wedged between competing bodegas on North 5th Street. The space had been cramped and poorly ventilated, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and motivational posters taped to concrete walls that sweated during Philadelphia's humid summers. But for Sarah, it had represented sanctuary in a neighborhood where safety was never guaranteed. Marcus Rivera had purchased the building with money saved from his brief professional career, back when he'd harbored dreams of fighting for championships instead of teaching neighborhood kids how to defend themselves. A detached retina had ended his competitive aspirations at 26, but instead of viewing that setback as defeat, he'd channeled his passion into something he believed was more meaningful, passing along the discipline and confidence that martial arts could provide. Sarah's introduction to Muay Thai had been born from necessity rather than choice. At 12, she'd been walking home from school when 3 older boys had cornered her in an alley behind a convenience store, demanding the few dollars she carried for lunch money. She'd handed over the cash without resistance, understanding instinctively that money could be replaced while injuries might not heal properly. When she'd arrived home that afternoon with a torn backpack and scraped knees, Marcus had listened to her story with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he was processing information on multiple levels. He'd cleaned her wounds with gentle efficiency, asked practical questions about the boys' ages and descriptions, and then made a decision that would reshape his daughter's entire future. "Tomorrow after school," he'd told her while applying bandages to her scraped palms, "you come to the gym. Time you learn some things that school can't teach you." Sarah's initial training had focused on basic self-defense techniques, mixed with traditional Muay Thai fundamentals. Marcus had been careful to emphasize that fighting should always be a last resort, that the goal of martial arts training was to develop the confidence and awareness needed to avoid dangerous situations entirely. But he'd also been realistic about the world his daughter was growing up in, understanding that sometimes avoidance wasn't possible. "The strongest fighters," he'd told her during one of their early sessions, "are the ones who never have to prove how strong they are. Your job is to be so prepared that preparation becomes unnecessary." Over the years, Sarah had absorbed not just the physical techniques of Muay Thai, but the mental discipline that separated true martial artists from people who simply knew how to throw punches. She'd learned to read body language with the precision of someone whose safety might depend on recognizing hostile intent before it fully manifested. She developed the kind of situational awareness that allowed her to assess threats and escape routes in any environment. Most importantly, she'd internalized her father's philosophy about the relationship between power and responsibility. Marcus had seen too many young fighters become intoxicated by their own capabilities, using their skills to intimidate rather than protect. He'd made sure Sarah understood that genuine strength required restraint, that the ability to hurt others carried with it an obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Standing in Riverside High's empty gymnasium, Sarah could almost hear her father's voice echoing off the walls as he guided her through combinations that had become as natural as breathing. The basic jab cross-hook sequence that every boxer learned first. The devastating elbow strikes that were Muay Thai's signature weapons. The knee techniques that could end fights instantly when applied with proper timing and precision. But it wasn't the physical techniques that Sarah found herself thinking about as she processed her confrontation with Brandon Walsh. It was the psychological training that Marcus had emphasized during her teenage years, when her natural athletic ability had begun attracting attention from coaches who wanted her to compete professionally. "Fighting isn't about being the strongest or the fastest," he'd explained during one particularly intense training session when Sarah had been struggling with a larger, more experienced sparring partner. "Fighting is about making better decisions under pressure than your opponent makes. Everything else is just technique." That lesson had served Sarah well throughout her competitive years, when she'd faced opponents who possessed superior reach, strength, or experience. She'd learned to turn their advantages against them, to remain calm while they became frustrated, to wait for the perfect moment to capitalize on their mistakes. The same principles applied to classroom management, though the stakes were different and the consequences more complex. Brandon Walsh represented a specific type of opponent, one who relied on intimidation and social positioning rather than actual skill or knowledge. His destruction of the phone had been a classic example of what Marcus would have called empty aggression, dramatic but ultimately ineffective gestures designed to mask fundamental insecurity. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting her reflection. The message was from Principal Carter, requesting a meeting first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the incident in third period. Word traveled fast in small schools, and Sarah wasn't surprised that Brandon's theatrical phone destruction had already reached administrative attention. She typed a brief confirmation and slipped her phone back into her pocket, understanding that tomorrow's meeting would likely determine how much latitude she'd have in managing future conflicts with problem students. Principal Carter had seemed supportive during Sarah's hiring process, but administrative support often evaporated when dealing with students whose parents wielded influence in the community. The drive from school to her apartment took Sarah through Millbrook's modest downtown district, past family-owned businesses and restaurants that closed early on weekday evenings. The quiet streets represented everything she'd been seeking when she'd left Philadelphia: predictability, safety, the kind of environment where her biggest concerns would involve lesson planning rather than personal security. Her apartment was a second-floor unit in a converted Victorian house, sparsely furnished with items she'd purchased from a discount furniture store during her first week in town. Sarah had never been someone who invested heavily in possessions, understanding from her father that too many material attachments could become liabilities when circumstances required rapid adaptation. The apartment's small spare bedroom had been converted into a training space, equipped with a heavy bag, floor mats, and a collection of focus mitts that she'd brought from Philadelphia. Sarah changed into workout clothes and began her evening routine, starting with the meditation practice that Marcus had taught her as a teenager. "Before you can control anything else," he'd explained, "you have to control your own mind. 10 minutes of stillness every day teaches you more about real strength than an hour of hitting things." The meditation helped Sarah process the day's events with emotional distance, analyzing Brandon's behavior and her own responses with the kind of objective clarity that would be impossible while still caught up in the immediate frustration of the confrontation. She could see now that his phone destruction had been a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond his ability to manage through his usual tactics. More concerning was what the incident revealed about the broader dynamics at Riverside High. Students like Connor and Dylan had watched their leader's meltdown with obvious discomfort, suggesting that Brandon's influence might be more fragile than it appeared. But fragile leadership often became more dangerous as it became more desperate, and Sarah understood that she might have inadvertently pushed Brandon into a corner from which he felt he couldn't retreat gracefully. After completing her meditation, Sarah moved through a series of Muay Thai forms that had become as automatic as brushing her teeth. The movements flowed together in sequences that emphasized both offensive techniques and defensive positioning, each transition designed to maintain balance while creating opportunities for counterattack. Her father had taught her these forms during evening sessions in his gym, after the paying students had gone home and the building had settled into comfortable quiet. Those had been some of Sarah's favorite memories, times when Marcus would share stories about his own fighting career while guiding her through increasingly complex combinations. "Every technique has to serve multiple purposes," he'd explained while watching her practice elbow strikes against the heavy bag. "This movement protects your head while setting up the next attack. This step creates distance while positioning you for a counter. Nothing you do should have just one function." The same principle applied to teaching, Sarah realized as she worked through combinations that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. Every classroom interaction served multiple purposes: establishing authority, building relationships, creating learning opportunities, maintaining safety. Brandon's phone incident had disrupted all of these functions simultaneously, forcing her to address his behavior while trying to preserve the educational environment for 28 other students. Sarah's phone rang as she finished her training routine, her father's name appearing on the caller ID. She'd been expecting this call, understanding that their weekly conversation schedule meant he'd be wanting to hear about her adjustment to the new job. "How's the teaching life treating you, Mija?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the warmth that always made her feel like she was still 12 years old and seeking his approval. "It's different from what I expected," Sarah admitted, toweling sweat from her face while settling into the apartment's single armchair. "The students here have different attitudes than what I dealt with in Philadelphia." "Different how?" Sarah found herself describing the day's events in more detail than she'd originally intended, explaining Brandon's behavior and her own responses while trying to convey the complex dynamics that made public school teaching so different from her previous experience. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds that indicated he was processing information rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Sounds like this kid's been allowed to run wild for a while," he said when Sarah finished her account. "Parents with money, teachers who don't want problems, administrators who take the path of least resistance. Creates a situation where someone like him starts thinking rules don't apply." "The thing is, he's not stupid," Sarah replied. "He knows exactly how far he can push without crossing lines that would bring real consequences." Today was the first time someone actually held firm on a boundary, and he didn't know how to handle it. So he broke his own phone to prove he was still in control. Exactly. And now I have to meet with the principal tomorrow to explain why a student destroyed his property in my classroom. Marcus was quiet for several moments, and Sarah could picture him in his small apartment above the gym, probably sitting in the recliner where he liked to watch boxing matches while analyzing techniques that younger fighters could learn from veteran competitors. "You remember what I taught you about reading opponents?" he finally asked. "Look for patterns. Everyone telegraphs their intentions if you know what to watch for. This Brandon kid, he's showed you his pattern. He escalates when he feels backed into corners, and he's willing to hurt himself if it means avoiding admitting weakness. That's dangerous thinking, because people like that don't know when to stop." Sarah understood her father's concern, recognizing it as the same protective instinct that had motivated him to teach her martial arts in the first place. Marcus had grown up in neighborhoods where conflicts could escalate from verbal confrontations to serious violence with shocking speed, and he'd learned to identify personality types that were most likely to make those dangerous transitions. "I'm not planning to back down," Sarah said, "but I also can't treat this like a street fight. There are professional considerations, administrative politics, parental involvement. It's more complicated than just establishing who's stronger. Strength isn't about muscles, Misha, you know that. Real strength is about making better decisions than the other person, staying calm when they lose control, being prepared for whatever comes next. All that training we did isn't just about physical techniques. It's about developing the mental discipline to handle any situation with confidence." They talked for another 20 minutes, Marcus sharing updates about the gym and the neighborhood, while Sarah described her apartment and the small-town rhythms she was still learning to navigate. But underlying their conversation was an understanding that her situation at Riverside High had entered territory that required careful attention and strategic thinking. After ending the call, Sarah stood on her apartment's small balcony, looking out over Millbrook's quiet residential streets while processing her father's advice. The town seemed almost impossibly peaceful compared to the urban environment where she'd grown up, but she was beginning to understand that conflict could arise anywhere when personalities and power structures collided. Tomorrow's meeting with Principal Carter would likely determine whether she'd have administrative support in maintaining classroom discipline, or whether she'd be expected to find ways to accommodate students like Brandon in the interest of avoiding controversy. Either outcome would require different strategies, but both would demand the kind of mental preparation that Marcus had taught her to value above physical readiness. Sarah returned to her spare bedroom and spent another 30 minutes practicing specific techniques that emphasized control and precision over power. Elbow strikes delivered with enough force to disable an opponent but with the accuracy needed to avoid causing permanent damage. Knee techniques that could end confrontations instantly while minimizing the risk of serious injury. Joint locks that caused compliance through pain rather than structural damage. These were the skills that separated professional fighters from street brawlers. Techniques that required years of practice to master because they demanded split-second decisions about appropriate levels of force. Sarah hoped she'd never need to use them outside of training, but her father's teachings had prepared her to be ready for situations that others might find unimaginable. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few short weeks. She'd come to Millbrook seeking simplicity and instead found herself navigating the same kinds of power struggles that had driven her away from Philadelphia. Different players, different stakes, but the same fundamental dynamics that arose whenever people with strong personalities competed for dominance in confined spaces. The broken phone pieces, now safely contained in a box on her kitchen counter, served as a reminder that Brandon Walsh had already demonstrated his willingness to escalate conflicts beyond rational boundaries. Tomorrow's meeting would reveal whether the school's administration was prepared to support teachers who maintained firm boundaries, or whether she'd be expected to find ways to accommodate behavior that undermined the learning environment for everyone else. Either way, Sarah understood that her training had prepared her for whatever challenges lay ahead. The question wasn't whether she could handle Brandon Walsh and his crew, but whether she'd be allowed to handle them using the methods that would be most effective in ending their disruptive behavior permanently. Principal Helen Carter's office occupied a corner of Riverside High's main administrative building, its large windows offering views of both the student parking lot and the faculty entrance. Sarah arrived precisely at 7:30 the following morning, 15 minutes before their scheduled meeting, carrying a thermos of coffee and a manila folder containing documentation of the previous day's incident. The early morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting geometric shadows across Carter's desk, where neat stacks of paperwork competed for space, with family photographs and a collection of motivational coffee mugs. Sarah had met the principal only briefly during her hiring process, but she'd formed an impression of someone who'd spent enough years in educational administration to develop efficient systems for managing the constant stream of crises that defined public school leadership. Helen Carter appeared in her doorway at exactly 7:45, dressed in the kind of practical business attire that suggested she understood the difference between looking professional and looking approachable. At 52, she possessed the confident bearing of someone who'd learned to navigate complex situations without losing sight of broader institutional goals. "Sarah, thank you for coming in early," Carter said, gesturing toward a pair of chairs arranged in front of her desk. "I thought it would be better to discuss yesterday's situation before the building fills up with students and staff." Sarah settled into the offered chair, noting how Carter had chosen to position their conversation away from the formal authority structure implied by sitting behind her desk. It was a small detail, but one that suggested the principal preferred collaborative problem-solving to hierarchical confrontation. "I understand there was an incident in your third-period class involving Brandon Walsh and his phone," Carter continued, pulling out a legal pad and uncapping a pen. "I'd like to hear your version of what happened, and then we can discuss how to move forward constructively." Sarah had spent considerable time the previous evening preparing for this conversation, understanding that her account of events would likely influence not just how the administration handled Brandon's behavior, but also how much autonomy she'd have in managing future classroom conflicts. She learned during her years at St. Catherine's that administrative meetings required the same kind of strategic thinking that martial arts competitions demanded: clear objectives, careful preparation, and the ability to adapt tactics based on her opponent's responses. Brandon refused to follow the classroom phone policy that applies to all students, Sarah began, keeping her voice neutral and factual. "When I asked him to place his device in the collection basket, he claimed to be texting his mother about a medical emergency. The content on his screen indicated he was actually using social media applications." Carter nodded, making notes without looking up from her legal pad. "How did you respond to his refusal?" "I gave him 3 opportunities to comply voluntarily, explaining that emergency communications could be handled through official school channels. When he continued to refuse, I informed him that persistent policy violations would result in administrative referral. And that's when he destroyed his phone?" Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. The physical act of phone destruction was undeniable, witnessed by an entire classroom of students who would undoubtedly share their versions of events throughout the school. But the context surrounding that action could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on whether the focus was placed on Brandon's deliberate defiance or on what might be characterized as a frustrated teenager's emotional outburst. "Brandon became agitated when he realized I intended to follow through on consequences for policy violations," Sarah said. "He stood up abruptly, made several comments about not accepting what he called power trip behavior, and then deliberately smashed his phone against his desk. The destruction appeared to be intentional rather than accidental." Carter continued writing, her expression remaining neutral despite the unusual nature of the incident being described. Sarah wondered how many similar conversations the principal had conducted over the years, whether student destruction of personal property in response to disciplinary expectations was common enough to have established protocols. "Were there any injuries resulting from the broken phone?" Carter asked. "No injuries, but glass fragments scattered across the floor near several student desks. I collected the debris after class to prevent anyone from being cut by sharp edges." "Good thinking. And how did the other students react to Brandon's behavior?" This question struck Sarah as particularly significant, suggesting that Carter understood the broader implications of allowing disruptive behavior to continue unchecked. Classroom management wasn't just about controlling individual problem students. It was about maintaining an environment where learning could occur for everyone else. "Most students seemed surprised by the level of Brandon's reaction," Sarah replied. "A few appeared uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed to view it as entertainment. The incident definitely disrupted the learning environment for the entire class." Carter set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of direct attention that suggested she was evaluating more than just the factual details of the previous day's events. Sarah had experienced similar moments during job interviews and performance evaluations. Understanding that experienced administrators often made decisions based on their assessment of a teacher's character and judgment, rather than on isolated incidents. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you can handle honest conversation," Carter said. Brandon Walsh is a challenging student who's been testing boundaries since his freshman year. His parents are significant figures in this community, and they've made it clear that they expect their son to be treated with what they consider appropriate respect. The warning was delivered diplomatically, but Sarah understood its implications clearly. Brandon operated under a different set of expectations than other students, protected by family influence that could create serious problems for teachers who failed to accommodate his behavior. It was a dynamic Sarah had encountered at St. Catherine's, where wealthy donors' children sometimes received special consideration that undermined classroom authority. "What kind of treatment do they consider appropriate?" Sarah asked. "They believe Brandon's academic challenges stem from anxiety and attention issues that require understanding rather than strict discipline. They've requested that teachers work with him individually to find solutions that don't involve traditional consequences." Sarah recognized this language as the carefully worded justification that parents often used when their children couldn't or wouldn't meet normal behavioral expectations. Medical terminology provided cover for what was essentially a request that rules be suspended for one particular student, creating the kind of double standard that inevitably led to broader classroom management problems. "Has this approach been effective in modifying his behavior?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Carter's slight grimace suggested that diplomatic solutions hadn't produced the desired results. "Brandon continues to struggle with authority figures and classroom expectations. Yesterday's incident represents an escalation beyond anything we've dealt with previously. What consequences will he face for destroying school property and disrupting the learning environment?" That's where things become complicated. Technically, Brandon destroyed his own property rather than school equipment, and his parents are likely to argue that he was responding to what they'll characterize as excessive pressure from a teacher who doesn't understand his special needs. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her shoulders, the same physical tension that had always preceded difficult sparring matches in her father's gym. She was being told, in carefully diplomatic language, that her authority to manage her own classroom was subordinate to the political considerations surrounding one problem student and his influential family. Marcus Rivera had prepared her for moments like this, though his lessons had focused on street confrontations rather than administrative politics. The same principles applied. Recognize when you're being backed into a corner, understand the real stakes involved, and choose your responses based on long-term strategic thinking rather than immediate emotional reactions. "What are you recommending as next steps?" Sarah asked. Carter consulted her notes before responding, though Sarah suspected the principal had already formulated her preferred approach before calling this meeting. Administrative decisions in situations like this typically reflected institutional priorities rather than purely educational considerations. "I think it would be beneficial for you to meet with Brandon's parents to discuss strategies for helping him succeed in your classroom. They're genuinely concerned about his academic progress, and they might be more receptive to collaborative solutions than adversarial ones." The suggestion was presented as a recommendation, but Sarah understood it as a requirement disguised as professional courtesy. She was being asked to negotiate directly with the source of Brandon's protection, to find ways to accommodate behavior that would be unacceptable from any other student. "When would this meeting take place?" Sarah asked. "I can arrange something for later this week if you're agreeable." Diana and Robert Walsh are busy people, but they make time for their son's education when necessary. Sarah nodded her acceptance while mentally preparing for a confrontation that would likely be more challenging than anything she'd faced in Brandon's classroom. Parents who wielded influence to protect their children's misbehavior typically possessed sophisticated arguments for why normal rules shouldn't apply to their families. The meeting concluded with Carter providing Sarah with background information about Brandon's academic history and previous behavioral incidents. The file painted a picture of a student who'd been struggling with authority since middle school, but whose problems had been consistently reframed as learning differences rather than conduct issues. Sarah walked back to her classroom with 15 minutes before first period, using the time to review her lesson plans while processing the implications of her conversation with Principal Carter. The administrative message had been clear: find a way to work with Brandon Walsh or face the consequences of opposing a family with enough influence to make her professional life difficult. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Heard you had a rough day yesterday. Some teachers never learn when to back off." The message was unsigned, but Sarah suspected its origin based on the timing and content. Someone was already working to intimidate her into changing her approach to classroom management. Sarah deleted the message without responding, understanding that engaging with anonymous threats would only escalate a situation that was already moving beyond simple student-teacher conflict. But the fact that someone had obtained her personal number and felt comfortable sending threatening communications suggested that her confrontation with Brandon had attracted attention from sources outside the school building. First period English proceeded normally, with students who seemed genuinely interested in learning and willing to participate in class discussions about literature and writing. The contrast with her third period group was stark, reminding Sarah why she'd become a teacher in the first place and what she was fighting to preserve. During her planning period, Sarah received a visit from Jennifer Park, a veteran English teacher who'd been working at Riverside High for over a decade. Mrs. Park knocked softly on the classroom door before entering with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of expression that suggested she had information to share. "Thought you might need this," Park said, offering one of the coffee cups while settling into a student desk near Sarah's workspace. Word travels fast in small schools, and yesterday's excitement has been the main topic of conversation in the teacher's lounge. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, recognizing that Park's visit represented either an offer of support or a diplomatic attempt to encourage different classroom management strategies. Veteran teachers often served as informal mentors for new faculty, but their advice typically reflected years of learning to navigate institutional politics rather than purely educational considerations. "What's the general consensus?" Sarah asked. Mixed reactions. Some people are impressed that someone finally stood up to Brandon Walsh. Others think you might have bitten off more than you can chew, considering his family's position in the community. Park's diplomatic phrasing conveyed information without requiring her to take explicit positions that might later be used against her in faculty politics. Sarah appreciated the careful balance, understanding that veteran teachers survived by avoiding unnecessary conflicts while still providing support for colleagues who needed guidance. "What can you tell me about his family's influence?" Sarah asked. Robert Walsh owns Walsh Automotive, which includes 3 dealerships and the largest auto repair facility in the county. Diana Walsh sits on the school board and chairs the education committee for the county commissioners. They're not people who accept being told their son needs to change his behavior. The information confirmed what Sarah had suspected based on Principal Carter's careful language during their morning meeting. The Walsh family possessed multiple sources of leverage over school operations, from employment opportunities that affected many faculty families to direct influence over educational policy and budget decisions. "How have other teachers handled conflicts with Brandon?" Sarah asked. Park sipped her coffee while considering her response, clearly weighing the risks of providing information that might be construed as criticism of colleagues or administrative policies. Most people find ways to work around his behavior rather than confronting it directly. Give him modified assignments, overlook minor policy violations, focus on students who actually want to learn. It's not ideal, but it's practical given the realities of the situation. Sarah understood that she was being offered a roadmap for professional survival, a way to avoid future conflicts by essentially exempting Brandon from normal classroom expectations. It was the same approach that had allowed his behavior to escalate over the years, but it was also the path of least resistance for teachers who couldn't afford to make powerful enemies. "What happened to teachers who didn't work around his behavior?" Sarah asked. Park's expression grew more serious, suggesting that this question touched on sensitive territory that most faculty preferred not to discuss openly. "There have been a few over the years who tried to treat Brandon like any other student. They usually found themselves dealing with increased scrutiny from administration, parent complaints about their teaching methods, and sudden budget cuts that affected their classroom resources. Nothing overtly retaliatory, but enough pressure to encourage them to seek positions elsewhere." The pattern was familiar to Sarah from her experience at St. Catherine's, where powerful families had used similar indirect methods to eliminate teachers who failed to provide their children with special treatment. It was a more sophisticated version of bullying, conducted through official channels and justified by appeals to educational philosophy rather than naked intimidation. "Are you suggesting I should modify my approach?" Sarah asked. "I'm suggesting you should be aware of what you're walking into. Brandon Walsh isn't just a difficult student. He's a symptom of broader political dynamics that affect everyone who works here." You can choose to fight those dynamics, but you should understand the potential costs before you commit to that path. Park finished her coffee and stood to leave, but paused at the classroom door with the kind of expression that suggested she had more to say but wasn't sure whether it would be wise to continue. "Sarah, can I give you some advice based on 15 years of teaching in this district?" "Of course." "Pick your battles carefully. There are fights worth having and fights that accomplish nothing except damaging your own position. Brandon Walsh has been winning his battles for years because he's fighting with weapons that teachers don't have access to. If you're determined to change that dynamic, you need to be prepared for a level of conflict that extends far beyond classroom management." After Park left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom considering the choice she was being offered. She could adapt her teaching methods to accommodate Brandon's behavior, joining the long list of faculty who'd chosen professional survival over educational principles. Or she could maintain her standards and face whatever consequences the Walsh family could arrange through their various sources of influence. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her of lessons learned during her competitive fighting years when she'd faced opponents who possessed advantages in size, strength, or experience. Marcus had taught her that the only way to overcome superior resources was through superior preparation, discipline, and strategic thinking. "You can't control what advantages your opponent brings to the fight," he'd told her during one particularly intense training session, "but you can control how well prepared you are, how clearly you think under pressure, and how committed you are to your objectives. Those factors determine more outcomes than people realize." Sarah understood that her conflict with Brandon Walsh had evolved beyond simple classroom management into something that would test everything her father had taught her about facing intimidation without backing down. The stakes were higher than she'd initially realized, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Maintain discipline, think strategically, and refuse to be defeated by opponents who relied on external advantages rather than personal merit. Third period approached with the weight of accumulated tension, as Sarah prepared to face Brandon Walsh for the first time since his dramatic phone destruction. She'd modified her lesson plan to minimize opportunities for disruption while maintaining educational objectives, understanding that today's class would likely be observed by students and faculty who were curious about whether yesterday's confrontation represented an aberration or the beginning of an ongoing conflict. Brandon entered the classroom precisely as the bell rang, flanked by Connor and Dylan in their usual formation. His bearing suggested someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for this encounter, probably receiving advice from parents who'd coached him on how to navigate teacher conferences and administrative meetings. Sarah recognized the body language of someone who believed he held superior strategic position. The broken phone had been replaced by a newer model, expensive enough to demonstrate that its destruction had caused no real hardship. Brandon placed the device prominently on his desk, a silent reminder of his willingness to escalate conflicts beyond rational boundaries while possessing the resources to absorb any resulting costs. Sarah began the day's lesson without acknowledging the previous day's incident, focusing on textual analysis techniques that required active student participation. Most of the class responded normally, but Brandon maintained pointed silence whenever called upon, making it clear that he was withdrawing his cooperation without technically violating any specific behavioral rules. It was a sophisticated form of passive resistance, designed to disrupt the learning environment while avoiding actions that could trigger administrative intervention. Sarah recognized it as the kind of calculated defiance that suggested Brandon had received coaching on how to make her position untenable without providing grounds for formal disciplinary action. The real message was unmistakable. Brandon Walsh was declaring war on her authority using weapons that extended far beyond anything available to other students. The question was whether Sarah possessed the skill and determination necessary to win a conflict against an opponent who'd never learned to accept defeat. The confrontation Sarah had been anticipating arrived 3 weeks later, on a gray Friday afternoon when most of the faculty had already departed for the weekend. She'd stayed late to grade essays in the quiet sanctuary of her classroom, preferring the empty building's peaceful atmosphere to the distractions of her apartment. The janitor's cart had passed by an hour earlier, and the hallways had settled into the kind of profound silence that only occurred when buildings designed for hundreds of people stood temporarily abandoned. Brandon's voice in the hallway shattered that tranquility like glass breaking against concrete. Sarah heard him before she saw him, his laughter echoing off metal lockers as he approached with Connor and Dylan in their familiar formation. Their footsteps carried the deliberate weight of people who believed they owned whatever space they occupied, unhurried and confident in ways that suggested this encounter had been planned rather than coincidental. "Looks like our favorite teacher decided to stick around," Brandon announced as the three of them appeared in her doorway, their silhouettes backlit by fluorescent hallway lighting. "Working late on a Friday night? That's kind of pathetic, don't you think?" Sarah looked up from the papers she'd been grading, taking a moment to assess the situation with the kind of tactical awareness her father had drilled into her during countless training sessions. Three opponents, positioned to block her primary exit route, displaying body language that suggested they'd moved beyond verbal intimidation into territory that might require physical response. The meeting with Brandon's parents had taken place the previous Monday, exactly as Principal Carter had arranged. Diana and Robert Walsh had arrived dressed in the kind of expensive casual attire that wealthy people wore to demonstrate they were making time for lesser concerns. The conversation had been polite on the surface, filled with educational jargon about differentiated instruction and individualized approaches to classroom management. Beneath the diplomatic language, however, the Walsh family had delivered a clear ultimatum: modify her teaching methods to accommodate Brandon's special needs, or face consequences that would extend far beyond simple administrative displeasure. They'd mentioned their connections to school board members, their influence over district budget decisions, and their disappointment with teachers who failed to understand the complexities of modern education. Sarah had listened with the patient attention that Marcus had taught her to show opponents who believed they were revealing strength while actually exposing weakness. The Walsh family's reliance on external pressure rather than addressing their son's behavior confirmed everything she'd suspected about the dynamics that had allowed Brandon's problems to persist and escalate. "I'm finishing some grading," Sarah replied calmly, setting down her pen while keeping her hands visible on the desk surface. "The building closes in 30 minutes. You three should probably head home." Brandon stepped further into the classroom, his movements carrying the kind of predatory confidence that suggested he'd been building toward this moment for weeks. Connor and Dylan spread out slightly, not quite surrounding her but positioning themselves to limit her movement options. Sarah recognized the tactical formation from her father's teachings about group confrontations, understanding that they'd probably discussed and rehearsed this encounter. "See, that's the thing," Brandon said, moving closer to her desk with deliberate slowness. "We've been talking, and we think it's time for you to understand how things work around here. You can't just come into our school and start acting like you run the place." Sarah stood up slowly, her chair rolling backward until it bumped against the whiteboard behind her desk. The movement was casual enough to appear natural while positioning her with better access to potential escape routes and weapon opportunities. Her father had taught her that preparation for violence began long before actual confrontation, through positioning and awareness that created tactical advantages. "Mr. Walsh, I think you should leave now," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with people who mistook aggression for strength. "This conversation isn't appropriate, and continuing it could create problems for everyone involved." Connor laughed from his position near the door, the sound carrying nervous energy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever they'd planned but felt committed to supporting his friend. Listen to her trying to sound all tough, like she's some kind of badass instead of just another teacher who doesn't know her place. Dylan remained silent, but his stillness had shifted from passive observation to active readiness. Sarah could see tension in his posture that indicated he was prepared to move quickly when the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. Her father had taught her to watch for these subtle physical changes, understanding that they often provided the only warning before violence erupted. "You embarrassed me in front of the whole class," Brandon continued, his voice rising slightly as emotional control began slipping away. "Made me look weak, made me destroy my own property just to prove a point. Nobody does that to me and gets away with it." Sarah recognized the psychology behind his words, understanding that Brandon's anger stemmed not from actual harm but from wounded pride that couldn't tolerate public challenges to his authority. Her father had encountered similar personalities in his gym, fighters whose egos were so fragile that any perceived slight became grounds for disproportionate retaliation. "You destroyed your own phone because you couldn't handle being held to the same standards as other students," Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady despite the escalating tension. "That was your choice, not mine." The words hit Brandon like physical blows, confirming fears about his public humiliation while offering no face-saving alternatives. Sarah watched his expression shift from calculated intimidation to genuine rage, recognizing the moment when rational thought gave way to emotional reaction. Brandon moved with surprising speed for someone his size, lunging across the space between them with his hands reaching for her shoulders. But Sarah had been reading his body language for the past several minutes, recognizing the subtle shifts in posture that preceded his attack. She was already moving when he committed to action, sidestepping with the fluid grace that came from years of training against opponents who possessed superior size and strength. Her left hand caught his extended wrist while her right palm struck his elbow joint, hyperextending his arm in a classic Muay Thai controlling technique that sent him stumbling sideways into the corner of her desk. The movement was precise and economical, designed to neutralize his attack while creating distance rather than causing unnecessary injury. Connor reacted to his friend's stumble by charging forward with the kind of wild aggression that untrained fighters often mistook for effective combat technique. Sarah pivoted to face him, her stance shifting automatically into the balanced position that Marcus had drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing. When Connor swung a haymaker punch aimed at her head, Sarah ducked under it while driving her right elbow upward into his solar plexus, with the devastating precision that made Muay Thai elbows legendary among martial artists. The strike landed with a sound like meat hitting a cutting board, doubling Connor over as his diaphragm spasmed and his legs buckled beneath him. Dylan hesitated for a crucial moment, torn between loyalty to his friends and sudden recognition that their intended victim possessed skills they hadn't anticipated. That hesitation gave Sarah time to assess his positioning while keeping Brandon and the gasping Connor in her peripheral vision. Brandon had recovered from his collision with the desk and was moving toward her again, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. This time his approach was more cautious, suggesting he'd learned something from their first exchange. But caution without proper training was merely delayed failure, and Sarah could see that his fundamental lack of fighting knowledge made him predictable, despite his size advantage. When Brandon grabbed for her again, Sarah used his momentum against him with a hip throw that sent him crashing into a row of student desks. The sound of his body hitting plastic and metal echoed through the classroom like a percussion symphony, followed by the clatter of supplies scattering across the linoleum floor. Dylan finally committed to action, but his attack lacked conviction and technique. Sarah caught his clumsy punch with an outside block, then delivered a knee strike to his thigh that buckled his leg and sent him hopping backward in pain. The techniques flowed together, with the kind of seamless integration that came from thousands of hours of practice, each movement serving multiple purposes while conserving energy for whatever came next. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the classroom now resembled a disaster zone. Connor remained doubled over near the whiteboard, struggling to breathe normally while making small, whimpering sounds. Dylan limped against the wall, clutching his thigh where her knee had struck the nerve cluster that controlled his leg function. Brandon lay amid the scattered desks, looking dazed and confused about how his planned intimidation had transformed into his own comprehensive defeat. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, her breathing barely elevated despite the physical exertion. Her stance remained balanced and ready, prepared for renewed attacks while hoping the demonstration had been sufficient to end the conflict permanently. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that her father had always displayed after successful sparring sessions. "Or do you need additional lessons in respect?" Brandon struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady, and his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked like what he actually was, a teenager who'd been allowed to believe his own mythology until reality intervened with decisive correction. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction that had characterized his earlier threats. "My parents are going to hear about this. You're finished at this school." Sarah walked calmly to her desk and picked up her phone, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "You're absolutely right that your parents will hear about this. I'm calling Principal Carter right now to report that 3 students attacked a teacher after school hours and were subdued using appropriate defensive force." The implications of her words hit the 3 boys like cold water. They'd entered her classroom planning to intimidate a helpless victim, but instead they'd created a situation where they were the aggressors, and she was the victim defending herself. Their plans for using family influence to destroy her career had just transformed into damage control efforts to avoid criminal charges for assault. "She attacked us," Connor wheezed, still struggling with the respiratory effects of her elbow strike. "We were just talking to her and she went crazy." Sarah held up her phone, showing them that she was already dialing. Principal Carter will review the security footage from the hallway cameras to determine exactly who entered whose space with aggressive intent. "I'm confident that evidence will support my version of events." Dylan and Connor looked toward Brandon for leadership, but their usual source of confidence appeared as shaken as they were. The boy who dominated their social circle through aggressive charisma had just been systematically dismantled by someone he'd dismissed as weak and controllable. Principal Carter arrived within 20 minutes, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy who'd been conducting routine security checks in the area. The sight of uniformed authority caused the three boys to deflate visibly, their bravado evaporating as they realized the potential consequences of their failed intimidation attempt. The security footage confirmed Sarah's account of events, showing Brandon and his friends entering her classroom uninvited while she was working alone. Their body language and positioning made their aggressive intentions unmistakable, while Sarah's responses appeared measured and defensive rather than retaliatory. Brandon's parents arrived within an hour, their earlier confidence replaced by damage control urgency. The conversation with Principal Carter and the deputy involved extensive discussion about whether criminal charges would be filed, with the Walsh family's influence temporarily neutralized by the clear evidence of their son's culpability. Sarah provided a detailed statement about the incident while receiving medical evaluation for minor bruises sustained during the confrontation. The paramedic who examined her expressed amazement that she'd emerged essentially uninjured from an encounter with three larger opponents, unaware that her father had spent 15 years preparing her for exactly this type of situation. The resolution came more swiftly than Sarah had anticipated. Brandon Walsh was suspended pending a disciplinary hearing, while Connor and Dylan faced similar consequences for their participation in what was officially characterized as attempted assault on a faculty member. The Walsh family's threatened retaliation never materialized, their influence neutralized by the undeniable evidence of their son's misconduct. More importantly, word of the incident spread through Riverside High with the speed that only teenage gossip networks could achieve. Students who'd witnessed Brandon's classroom disruptions suddenly understood why their new English teacher had maintained such unwavering standards. Faculty members who'd encouraged her to compromise found themselves reassessing their own approaches to classroom management. Sarah resumed teaching the following Monday with a classroom atmosphere transformed by respect rather than fear. Students who'd tested boundaries during her first weeks now participated eagerly in discussions, understanding that their teacher possessed both the knowledge to educate them and the strength to protect the learning environment they deserved. Her father called that evening to check on her adjustment to small-town teaching, unaware of the events that had finally established her position at Riverside High. "How are things going with that problematic student?" Marcus asked during their weekly conversation. "We reached an understanding," Sarah replied, looking out her apartment window at Millbrook's quiet residential streets. "Turns out some people just need clearer boundaries than others." Marcus chuckled, recognizing something in his daughter's tone that suggested she'd successfully applied lessons learned in his gym to challenges encountered in her classroom. "Boundaries are important, Mija. Glad you found a way to establish them without compromising your principles." Sarah spent that weekend designing lesson plans for students who finally understood that respect was earned through character, rather than demanded through intimidation. The broken phone pieces still sat in a box on her kitchen counter, serving as a reminder that some conflicts required more than words to resolve permanently. Brandon Walsh never returned to her classroom, transferring to another school district where his parents hoped to find educators more willing to accommodate their son's special needs. Sarah heard occasionally that he was struggling to adjust to environments where family influence couldn't override personal accountability, but she felt no satisfaction in his difficulties. Teaching at Riverside High had become what she'd originally hoped it would be, an opportunity to inspire young minds while making a positive difference in her community. The skills her father had taught her remained available if needed, but her classroom operated on foundations of mutual respect that made violence unnecessary. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.